Okay, now the next place we want to go to in this journey through the nervous system is to talk a little bit about the brain and the cranial nerves. Now, the brain sits atop the central nervous system and is concerned with the reception of stimuli that are brought to it from the spinal cord and the brainstem via the peripheral nerves, which bring the information into the spinal cord through the ventral roots. We then process that information at the level of the cerebral cortex, and we assign that information a category based on the type of stimulus that it is. It could be sound or sight, or it could be what we call our general senses, the feeling of your body's position in space, or pain, or pressure, or touch, what we call our somatic senses. And what will happen is that will make its way into the back of the spinal cord through the dorsal root, will go via ascending pathways up to the brainstem, and then the brainstem will pass that information on to a structure called the thalamus, which is part of the diencephalon, which sits on top of the midbrain, which sits on top of the brainstem. The thalamus will then allow certain of that information to get all the way to the cerebral cortex, where we'll eventually become aware of it. The brain will assign a category to that stimulus and then integrate that information into a concept of what's happening to us and in us, and pass that information over to the frontal lobe of the brain, where we'll form a plan of action, what to do about what it is that's going on around us. That plan of action will then be sent from the brain to the brain stem via the diencephalon, and then passed some of it to the cerebellum, and then the rest of that information is going to head down the spinal cord and exit out the ventral root to the peripheral nerves, where those nerves will talk to a target. Now, the target could be a muscle, could be a gland, could be some other kind of tissue, but at that point some sort of action will take place. Cranial nerves leave the brain and go mainly to the head, where they receive information and they send it back to the brain, and these are what we call sensory nerves. And then the brain sends back instructions to move, and this is motor information. Remember that sensory information we call afferent information or incoming information, and motor information we call efferent information, or information that's heading out to the effectors. Now, the way to remember this is to think E for exit, E for efferent. Efferent information exits the spinal cord and heads to the targets. At the top of the spinal cord, beginning at the level of foramen magnum and filling the skull, is the brain, which can be split into several anatomical and functional parts. The brain is made up of the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. The cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. It's probably the part you think of most often when you think of the brain. It's that big, wrinkly thing that has two halves to it, a left half and a right half. These halves are called hemispheres, and the split between them is called the longitudinal fissure. The cerebellum looks like a hunk of turkey burger that hangs underneath the occipital lobe of the brain, which is that part of the brain at the back of the skull under the occipital bone. And its job is primarily to coordinate what we're trying to do with what we're actually doing. The surface of the cerebrum isn't smooth. You know that it's wrinkly, right? It's got grooves and it's got ridges. The ridges are called gyri and the grooves are called sulci, and collectively these are called convolutions. They're very important because they increase the surface area of the brain so that you can pack more brain in a smaller space. The brain has a lot of work to do, and it has to do it in a relatively small volume. And so what we try to do is increase the amount of working area that it has, and that's what these gyri and sulci accomplish. Most of the sulci are variable in their location in humans, but a few are in basically the same place in every single brain, and they divide the brain into separate lobes. These are named for the skull bones that are on top of them, and they occur in pairs with one in each hemisphere. The most anterior lobes that are separated from the rest of the brain by the central sulcus, which runs across the top of the cerebral cortex like a barrette, are the frontal lobes. The frontal lobes are responsible for motor activity, for conscious thought, and also for speech. This is where most of our heavy thinking and problem solving goes on. Now you might ask, how do we know this? And that's a good question, because the brain is one of those few organs that we can't take out, work on, and put back and have it operate. So a lot of the information that comes to us about the function of the brain comes primarily from animal models, where we can experiment on the brain and observe the effects on behavior, or from individuals that have brain damage, where as a result of trauma or disease, one or the other part of their brain, or brainstem, or cerebellum, is damaged, and we observe the deficits in their behavior. In other words, what can't they do as a result of having this part of their brain damaged? Now, the problem with that kind of an analysis is that it's not always entirely accurate, because the brain is made up of a lot of interdependent structures. They rely on each other in sort of a foundation scenario. And I guess the best way to draw an analogy would be, let's imagine, for instance, that I went down to the first floor of the building of our school, and I pulled out the cornerstone, and I saw the whole building fall over. And I said, well, okay, this cornerstone must be responsible for the electricity working right, the plumbing working right, um, the building standing up straight, and everything else that went into making it basically a home for people to learn. And that would be an over conclusion based on the data. What I had done by pulling the cornerstone out is I removed a structural component from the building that everything else was standing on top of, and that's what caused those other things to break down. And the same thing is true in people that have brain damage. You don't necessarily have to assign all these different deficits in behavior or information processing to the part of the brain that's been damaged. And so when we talk about what different parts of the brain do, we have to kind of take it with a grain of salt, because it's probably only accurate to a certain degree. Behind the frontal lobes are the parietal lobes, which are involved in body sense perception, in primary taste, and in speech. And behind the parietal lobes are the occipital, that are responsible for processing visual information. The parietal lobes are interesting because the parietal lobes receive information from inside and outside the body. They bring it in, and most of this information is what we call somatosensory information, and it arrives at a very special place in the parietal lobe that's called the postcentral gyrus, or the somatosensory cortex, where different parts of the postcentral gyrus correspond to different locations on the body. One part of the postcentral gyrus, for instance, will represent information that comes in from the hands, another part information that comes in from the face and the lips, another part from the legs and the arms, and so on. And the amount of surface area in that special gyrus that's dedicated to that body part isn't necessarily proportional to our body proportions. And so what you can do, as we'll see a little bit later on, is draw an unusually shaped human called a homunculus based on these dimensions that come from the postcentral gyrus. And the sensory homunculus would have a big head and big eyes and big lips and a big nose, big hands and feet, and a very, very tiny body. Okay? And the reason for that is that we have a lot less sensory information coming in from our trunk and our arms and our legs than we do from our hands and our feet and our face. Okay. Most inferior lobes are separated by lateral sulci. These are the temporal lobes, and they're involved in hearing and in smell and in the integration of emotion. Way to remember that, your temporal lobes and your ears. Your ears, of course, contain the organs that change sound information into electrical information. That's the cochlea that's in the inner ear of each of your ears. And also, contains another organ that's involved in our sense of balance. And these are the semicircular canals and the vestibular apparatus, and that information actually goes to a different part of the brain. There's a section of the brain called the insula that lies underneath the temporal lobe and the parietal and frontal lobe, so you have to kind of pull those lobes away to see it. And it's often listed as a fifth lobe, but it's not visible on the surface. It sort of runs across the top of the thalamus. Much of the information that comes into the brain is contralateral, meaning that if it comes in from the right side of the body, the left side of the brain deals with it, and vice versa. And the same is true of the commands that the brain issues. The right side of the brain controls the left half of the body, and vice versa. And a lot of people have asked, well, why is this so? And the best answer that I've been able to find is we really don't understand why that is, why the brain exhibits contralateral control, which is controlling the opposite side of the body from where the hemisphere is at, versus ipsilateral control, which would be same-sided control, because there are animals that have ipsilateral nervous systems, but most higher vertebrates have this contralateral control. And this is just a look at the brain and some of the different lobes, and so you can see the frontal and the parietal lobes, and there's the temporal and occipital lobe, there's the cerebellum, and there, of course, is the brain stem. Okay? So you can also see the ridges and the grooves. The gyri, of course, are the ridges, the grooves are the sulci, and now you get an idea of where these lobes are located. They're named for the bones that lie on top of them, right? The occipital lobe lies under the occipital bone, the temporal lobe under the temporal bone, the parietal under the parietal bone, the frontal under the frontal bone, and so on. Now, the next part of the brain we want to talk about is the cerebellum, and it lies posterior to the cerebrum and inferior to the cerebrum. It lies underneath the occipital lobe. It is divided into two hemispheres, a right and a left, by a raised ridge that's called the vermis, and the surface has ridges and grooves in it, similar to the way that the cerebral cortex does, except that the ridges and grooves are more parallel in the cerebrum than they are in the cerebellum. But the purpose is the same, which is to increase the surface area of the organ so it can do a lot of electrical work. From its external appearance, it's easy to see why cerebellum is literally Latin for little brain, because it looks like a smaller version of the cerebral cortex in many respects. It's involved in sensory collection, in motor coordination, and in balance. Again, if we were to categorize the cerebellum's job in the simplest possible terms, it would simply be to coordinate what we're trying to do with what we're actually doing. So it tries to sync up our intentions with our actions. The brainstem lies beneath the cerebellum and anterior to it, and it's partially covered by the cerebrum, and it's divided into three sections. The medulla oblongata, which is the most inferior part, it's continuous with the spinal cord and responsible for impulses that control your heartbeat, your respiration, and the diameter of your blood vessels. So a lot of your vital functions go on at the level of the medulla oblongata. The pons is right on top of it, and it looks like a little bulging anterior portion of the brainstem. It sort of sticks out in front. And the midbrain, which is just atop the pons, it's the most superior portion of the brainstem and is completely covered by the cerebrum. And so this is just a look at some of the functions of these different parts of the brainstem. You could not live without your brainstem. The midbrain relays sensory and motor information to and from the cerebral cortex, as well as the cerebellum. The pons relay sensory and motor information. It also has a role in rhythmic breathing. And the medulla oblongata regulates your vital functions, as an example, heart rate, blood pressure, breathing. It's also a reflex center for coughing and sneezing, as well as swallowing and vomiting. There are some amazing cases of children who've been born without a cerebral cortex, but who have an active brainstem, and they're able to interact with their environment. They're able to respond to stimuli and digest and make waste. They can't do a lot of, heavy thinking and problem solving, but they can still live. And what makes this interesting is the fact that if you look at the brains of some more primitive animals like reptiles and amphibians and even fish, their brains look a lot like a human brain stem. The cerebellum, uh, the cerebrum was one of the last things to show up in evolution, and the evidence of that it comes from two different phenomena. One is the fact that we really don't see a cerebral cortex of any note until we get to the mammals, and we don't really see the cerebral cortex show up until relatively late in the development of the central nervous system. So this was one of the last things really to form. The brainstem contains the reticular activating system, which is a network of neurons that are responsible for waking up the cerebral cortex. Essentially, they allow certain sensory information to get to our conscious awareness in order for us to regain consciousness. General anesthesia inhibits the function of the reticular system and causes us to remain unconscious. Injury to this area can lead to coma. Now, the brainstem gets sensory information and it contains control systems for our vital signs, such as blood pressure, our heart rate, and our ventilation. Damage to the brainstem can often result in death. And what you're looking at here is just a peek at where the brainstem is located relative to the cerebellum and the cerebral cortex. So you can see here the spinal cord, the medulla oblongata, and there's the pons, and then this part is kind of covered up by the cerebral cortex. You can see here portions of the pons in the midbrain, and then above the midbrain is the diencephalon, which is made up of three structures: the epithalamus, the thalamus, the subthalamus, and the hypothalamus. If we look here at the coverings of the brain, you can see the three meningeal layers that are similar to the layers that surround the spinal cord. You can pick up here the dura mater, shown here in brown, and the subdural space, which drains a lot of blood from the brain. These areas that are filled with blood are called venous sinuses. The arachnoid mater, and then beneath it, the subarachnoid space, which you can see down here. And then you can see the pia mater, which actually clings very close to the contours of the brain. And then, of course, here is the gray matter of the brain and the white matter of the brain. Just the same way that the spinal cord has white and gray matter, the brain also does. The gray matter is primarily nerve cell bodies and unmyelinated axons, so there's a lot of signal processing that goes on here, while the white matter is mostly myelinated axons and it's involved in signal transmission. The brain, just like the spinal cord, is covered with protective membranes that are called meninges. And the meninges of the brain are continuous with the same meninges that surround the spinal cord. An infection of the meninges is called meningitis. It can be caused by bacterial or viral infection, and it can sometimes be a fatal condition that can rapidly spread and affect brain and spinal cord function through this common covering. Obviously, it can result in injury of neurons, and eventually their function can shut down. Now, stroke is quite simply a disruption of blood flow to a region of the brain, and this can occur either by blocking the blood flow or, in some cases, by bursting a blood vessel, in which case it's called an aneurysm. If oxygen is disrupted for the brain long enough, the tissue is going to die. Symptoms can occur suddenly, and they'll vary depending on the location, and they can include sensory, language, motor, and memory deficits. A cerebrovascular accident is a major stroke where the brain tissue dies because there's not enough blood getting to it, and the symptoms are generally permanent. A transient ischemic attack is termed a mini stroke, and the patients are going to have stroke-like symptoms that will eventually fade away. It can be a precursor, however, to a major stroke. Now, sometimes what can happen is that the part of the brain that's damaged due to a cerebrovascular accident and contains important information about how to do certain things or how to perceive certain things, that information can sometimes be relearned through training uh, and through cognitive therapy. Um, we can utilize parts of the brain and make novel connections between the neurons that allow us to regain some of the abilities that we lost when the stroke took place. Now, this doesn't always happen, but the reason this is important is because it points to a very important property of the brain, which we call plasticity, which is the ability of the brain to sort of change its connections as it experiences the world around it. This is just a look at a stroke. Okay, this guy's having an embolus in his common carotid, cutting off blood flow to the brain. This can result in extensive areas of damage to the cortical matter and also to the deeper white matter of the brain. And here's a look at what a cerebrovascular accident might appear like, and this is a coronal section through brain tissue, and you can see where essentially he bled out. Okay, so that's a cross section showing a CVA, and then there's an example of an embolus. And remember that an embolus is a traveling clot, and when it lodges in a blood vessel, it's called a thrombus. Now, if we look deep inside the brain, it's got a lot of white and gray matter. The gray matter is mostly on the surface, the cortex, and the white matter is underneath it. But within that white matter are some areas of gray matter. There's also hollow cavities inside the brain that manufacture a very special liquid called cerebrospinal fluid. The white matter of the brain is surrounded by the gray matter on the surface, and the layer of gray matter that surrounds the surface is called the cortex. Cortex is just a term that anatomists use, and it literally means bark or outer covering. So whenever you see cortex, think outer covering. In the cerebrum, it's called cerebral cortex, and in the cerebellum, it's the cerebellar cortex. There are also tiny islands of gray matter underneath the cortex that are within the white matter that are called nuclei. Examples include the basal nuclei, which coordinate motor function, and the limbic system, which controls emotion, mood, and memory. The limbic system you could think of as our emotional brain. Essentially, its job is to apply a visceral or an emotional reaction to a particular stimulus. For instance, we might think of a massage as feeling good, and of something painful like a cut or a puncture as feeling bad. If we didn't have a limbic system, we wouldn't make those associations. We would simply note that the cut or the puncture happened, and we would note that the massage happened, but we wouldn't be able to attach an emotional component to it. Inside of the cerebrum, um, we have areas that reflect the external anatomy of the lobes. There are frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital regions in the internal anatomy that we can see very easily. On either side of the central sulcus are two gyri that are responsible for, in the case of the precentral gyrus, um, receiving completed plans of movement from the frontal lobe that it will then send down to the basal nuclei, the cerebellum, and the brainstem, and eventually that information will head down the spinal cord and out through the ventral roots to the peripheral nerves that talk to the muscles. And on the postcentral gyrus, what we have is an area that's responsible for receiving information from the inside and the outside of the body and interpreting that, assigning a category to that stimulus. That happens in an area near the postcentral gyrus called the sensory association area. This is just what the brain looks like from the top, and you can see here the right and the left hemisphere. This is the front of the brain, and this is the back. This would be the occipital lobe here. This area here would be the parietal lobe. That's another parietal lobe here. Okay, and in this area, from here all the way up to here will be the frontal lobes. Okay, the frontal lobe in the right here and the frontal lobe in the left up here. This is the longitudinal fissure, and this is the central sulcus that runs centrally across the center of the brain, kind of like a hair barrette does, and you can see the two gyri on either side. Okay, this is what the brain looks like if we were to take a mid-sagittal cut through it. And what you can see is, of course, the skin over the cranium, and these are the cranial bones. And then all this stuff here, this is cerebral cortex, okay? And then as we get down deeper inside the brain, we have an area of white matter here. It doesn't look white in the picture, but it should be white, called the corpus callosum. And what this is an area of white matter that attaches the right and the left half of the brain to each other so they can talk to each other. Here you can see the frontal lobe, and here is the parietal and the occipital lobe. Here's the cerebellum. And deep inside the cerebellum is this area of white matter that's called the arbor vitae, which literally means tree of life. In front of the cerebellum, you've got the medulla oblongata and the pons in the midbrain. This is the thalamus right here, which is part of the diencephalon. This is the hypothalamus, and this right here is the fornix. Back here is the pineal gland, which secretes a hormone called melatonin, which in part controls when we should be active and when we should be asleep. So it's part of our circadian rhythm. And then down here, underneath the hypothalamus, is the pituitary gland, and its job really is to control the other endocrine organs and tell them what to do by secreting chemicals called hormones. The special kind of hormones that the pituitary makes that command the other endocrine organs are called trophic hormones. The pituitary has two lobes, a lobe in the front that's called the anterior, and a lobe in the back that's called the posterior. And the pituitary is controlled by the hypothalamus, this little cone-shaped region underneath the thalamus right here. There are also areas in the skull bones that lighten them. We've talked in the past about the sinuses in the frontal bone, in the maxillary bone, in the sphenoid, in the ethmoid, and in the temporal bone that lighten the bone and also help with phonation, the production of sound. You can see some of those sinuses here and here. And then, of course, below the brainstem, you can see the spinal cord. Okay? Now, if we take a coronal section through the brain, where we cut essentially along the central sulcus, you can see the cortex, the gray matter, and you can see the white matter underneath it. And then within the white matter, you can see the basal nuclei. So these are the basal nuclei here, here, and here. Okay? And you can also pick up portions of the thalamus. That's part of the diencephalon. The job of the thalamus is to act as a gateway for stimulus to reach the cerebral cortex. So it picks and chooses what's important for our brain to be consciously aware of, and the rest of the stimulus stays at the level of the thalamus. And our body still responds to it, but we're not aware of those responses or those stimuli. You can also see some of the hollow chambers inside the brain where cerebrospinal fluid is made. We can pick out here portions of the lateral ventricle, and you can see a little bit of the third ventricle here. This is the fornix right here. We saw a look at that in the sagittal section. And then you can pick out here, I'm sorry, I have third ventricle down here. And you can pick out here the hypothalamus, the area that controls the pituitary gland. You've got a set of structures on either side of the longitudinal fissure. The precentral gyrus is just in front of the central sulcus in the frontal lobe of the brain, and it contains the primary motor cortex, which is the part of the brain that receives motor plans from the frontal lobe, from the motor association area, and it passes that information to the basal nuclei, which then pass it to the cerebellum, and from there the information goes to the brainstem and eventually to the spinal cord. Each part of the primary motor cortex controls a different part of the body, and this creates a map of the body that's sometimes called the motor homunculus or little man. The body parts that perform the more coordinated movements require more surface area on the precentral gyrus, and so they're inordinately large compared to the rest of the body parts, and the parts that receive that aren't capable of coordinated movement are relatively underrepresented in the precentral gyrus. Other frontal lobe structures include the premotor and the prefrontal areas that help plan the movements before they happen, and Broca's area, which is important in movement that's associated with speech. And so what you're looking at here is just the motor areas of the brain, and you can see how big the hands and the feet and the face are, and how tiny the arms and the trunk and the legs are. And so if we assemble this into a human being, it would look like this. Okay, so you can see how the areas of the body that have the greatest motor control are the ones that are biggest in this model of our little man. Okay. The postcentral gyrus is just behind the central sulcus in the parietal lobe, and it contains the somatosensory cortex, which is where information from the body surface comes in, and that eventually gets passed on to the motor or to the sensory association area, where we assign a category to the stimulus. Each portion of the somatosensory cortex gets input from a different part of the body, and it also creates a map of the body on the brain that's similar in proportion to the map of the motor homunculus, although there are some slight differences. Basically, areas of the body that have more sensory receptors are going to be bigger, and areas of the body that have fewer sensory receptors are going to be relatively small. So the size parts of the map are proportional to the amount of sensory input that come in. Other areas of the parietal lobe are the somatic sensory association area that allows understanding and interpretation of sensory information. This is an important part of the brain because this is where we put a category onto the stimulus. We decide whether it's sound or light or pain or tickle or touch or whatever. We give it a category, and then once we gather all that information from the somatosensory cortex and in the other lobes that receive sensory information, we pass that concept of what we're experiencing eventually to the frontal lobe, where we decide what we want to do about it. Wernicke's area controls our understanding of speech, and it's also found in the parietal lobe. And so here you can see the primary somatic sensory area. Remember that the bigger the body part, the more sensory information is coming from that body part, and vice versa. And so you can see here that the hands and the fingers and the lips and the tongue and the face are overrepresented, and the rest of the body is relatively small. And if you think about it, think about all the things that you can do sensory-wise with your hands that you can't do with other parts of your body. For instance, blind people can read Braille with their fingertips, and they couldn't do that with their elbow or their foot. And the reason is that there are more touch receptors in the fingers than anywhere else in the body, with the exception of the face and the lips and the tongue. The corpus callosum is a big area of white matter, and these are what are called commissural tracts. And what they do is they send information from the left to the right hemisphere, so that the right half of the body knows what the left half of your body is doing. And this is very important because if this didn't happen, then something as simple as walking across the room would be impossible, because when you lifted up your right leg to begin walking, if your left side of your body didn't know what was coming, you might fall on the ground. Okay, that's just one example. A lot of day-to-day activities require both sides of the body, and as a result, communication between both sides of the brain. Now, sometimes what can happen is that people can have an injury to this region of the brain, And what happens when that occurs is that the right and the left half side of the body, they don't they don't communicate with each other as effectively, and you might have activities going on the right side of the body that conflict with activities that are going on the left side of the body. For instance, in people that suffer from this condition, they might have one hand, say, buttoning their shirt at the same time that their left hand unbuttoned it, and they wouldn't be aware that those activities were going on because the two sides of the brain aren't communicating. And this is something that we call phantom hand. It's a very unusual situation for people with a functioning brain to understand because people that have this condition often don't acknowledge one side of their body as belonging to them, and so they'll neglect it. They might not even wash or shave it or think of it as part of them at all. Underneath the cerebrum is the diencephalon, and it's sort of covered by the white and the gray matter, and it's made up of several parts: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the pineal body, and the pituitary gland, as well as the epithalamus and the subthalamus. The glands represent a connection between the nervous system and the endocrine system. Um, there's one other place where the nervous and the endocrine system come together, and that's in the middle of the adrenal gland called the adrenal medulla. And the reason that this is interesting is because a lot of different kinds of medicine take advantage of the fact that if we treat not just your physical symptoms but also your way of thinking, that you often recover from disease conditions more effectively than if we simply deal with the physical symptoms alone. And the basis of this is this mind-body connection that exists between the central nervous system and the endocrine system, which controls a whole host of body functions. So it contains a number of nuclei that are part of the basal nuclei as well as the limbic system. And we'll list them here. You can see the thalamus, which is a sensory filter. It sends information to the cerebrum. The hypothalamus regulates the pituitary gland, so it controls hormone levels and temperature, as well as water balance, thirst, appetite, and emotion. It also regulates the entire endocrine system through the anterior pituitary. The pineal body is responsible for the secretion of melatonin, which basically, along with the thalamus and the reticular activating system, determines when we should be awake and when we should be asleep. And the pituitary secretes hormones that govern the function of the rest of the endocrine system, as well as things such as water balance, blood pressure, and the contraction of smooth muscle. Okay. Now, external similarities between the cerebellum and the cerebrum also show up when we look inside these structures. The cerebellum has gray matter on the outside and white matter in the center in the form of a tree-shaped area of white matter called the arbor vitae, which is Latin for tree of life. The cerebellum also has nuclei that coordinate motor and sensory activity. Essentially, the cerebellum's job is to fine-tune skeletal muscle activity and help in the maintenance of balance, and again, coordinate what we're trying to do with what we're actually doing. Now, the brain floats inside the cranial cavity in a sea of cerebrospinal fluid, which are made in special hollow chambers inside the brain that are called ventricles. And what they do is they filter the blood plasma and they produce a fluid that helps maintain a nice homeostatic environment for the neurons in the brain and the spinal cord. The cavities inside the brain are filled with this fluid, and it's continuous with the central canal of the spinal cord that runs right down the middle of the gray matter and the subarachnoid space. There's 4 ventricles, 2 lateral ventricles in the cerebrum, a 3rd ventricle in the diencephalon, right between the 2 thalami, and the 4th ventricle, which is in front of the cerebellum and behind the pons, and is connected to the third ventricle by a structure called the cerebral aqueduct. And you can see some of these areas here. The third ventricle would be essentially right around here, and the lateral ventricle would be essentially um, behind um, this thin membrane called the septum pellucidum, which is right here, and it looks sort of like a backwards Cincinnati Reds logo, and it's contained inside each cerebral hemisphere. So you've got one in the left and one in the right. And they're connected to the third ventricle by the interventricular foramina. The cerebrospinal fluid flows from the lateral ventricles to the third ventricle, and then this is the cerebral aqueduct that connects the third ventricle to the fourth. And when we get to the fourth ventricle, what happens is that the fluid moves out through a couple of openings on the side that are called lateral apertures, and one in the middle that's called the median aperture, and then the fluid flows all around the outside of the brain and also all around the outside of the spinal cord. And the fluid also heads down the central canal and bathes the inside of the spinal cord. And its job is to maintain homeostasis, remove waste products, essentially keep the neurons happy. Eventually what happens is that the cerebrospinal fluid gets reabsorbed back into the circulation at special structures in the arachnoid mater called arachnoid granulations. The cerebrospinal fluid rejoins the circulation, so as quickly as it's made, it's reabsorbed, and as a result, the pressure inside the cranial cavity and the vertebral canal doesn't change normally. Now, sometimes what will happen is it will have an interference in the flow where we either block the movement of the cerebrospinal fluid or we simply make it quicker than we can reabsorb it, and that can result in an increase in intracranial pressure. If this happens in an infant, it can cause the skull to expand, and this is a condition called water on the brain or hydrocephaly. If this happens in an adult, this can lead to coma and death. What we do to treat this condition, as we'll see in a bit, is that we put a shunt into the ventricle upstream of where the block is, and then we drain that fluid into the abdominal pelvic cavity where the peritoneum, which is the membrane that lines the abdominal pelvic cavity, reabsorbs that fluid, returns it to the circulation, and then the pressure in the cranium goes down and everything is okay. And we have to leave that shunt in for the rest of the person's life in the event that the flow of the CSF gets blocked again. So CSF is filtered in the blood in ventricles in a tissue area called the choroid plexus, which is a cluster of capillaries that are covered by ependymal cells. CSF in the lateral ventricles flows through a tiny opening called the interventricular foramen into the third ventricle, and then through the cerebral aqueduct into the fourth. It then flows into the central canal of the spinal cord and also into the subarachnoid space, and is returned to the blood through these arachnoid granulations that are between the subarachnoid space and the blood spaces in the dura. And as we pointed out, sometimes we have problems getting that cerebrospinal fluid to circulate through the ventricles of the brain. We have too much CSF in the skull, and that produces a condition called hydrocephalus. Causes can include blockage of the passages due to trauma or birth defects or tumor, or decreased reabsorption of cerebrospinal fluid at the granulations. And this causes the intracranial pressure to go up, and in some cases the increased pressure inside the skull can crush brain tissue and can result in coma and death. Other cases may have no obvious rise in pressure, and we call this normal pressure hydrocephaly. Symptoms can include expansion of the skull in infants whose skulls have yet to knit. The flat bones still have cartilage between them, so they can still open up a little bit. Nausea, vomiting, and irritability are sometimes seen. Also seizures, headache, blurred vision, balance and coordination problems, sleepiness, changes in personality, and dementia. How do we diagnose? Well, we can do a CT scan or an MRI to show enlarged ventricles. We can monitor the intracranial pressure. We treat with medications More commonly, we do a shunt in order to drain the cerebrospinal fluid into the abdominal pelvic cavity, as you can see here. Here's the child with the hydrocephalus. We put the shunt in, and now everything goes back to normal as the intracranial pressure begins to drop. Okay, now for the CNS to work, it has to be connected to the outside world through the nerves of the peripheral nervous system. Like the spinal cord has spinal nerves, the brain has cranial nerves, which are like the spinal nerves in that they are input and output pathways for the brain. There's only 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and all but 2 of them come from the brain stem. Not all mixed nerves, like spinal nerves, are cranial nerves. Some cranial nerves are motor, some cranial nerves are only sensory, and some cranial nerves are mixed. They're much more specialized than spinal nerves, and they carry sensory and motor information from the head, the face, and the neck, and also visual, auditory, olfactory, and gustatory sensation. Peripheral neuropathy is damage to these nerves, and it can happen not just to spinal nerves. Cranial nerves can also experience neuropathy. Symptoms that would be seen on the face and the head or in special senses could occur. They could affect vision, hearing, equilibrium, taste, and smell. And what you're looking at here are the cranial nerves. Okay, so they're listed in order. The Roman numerals are numbered from closest to the nose to closest to the spinal cord. And what we can see here, the color coding, this is the cerebrum, where the nuclei of the nerve are in the cerebrum. In blue, it's the nuclei are in the diencephalon. Green, the midbrain. Purple, the pons. And orange, the medulla. And the way that these are numbered, again, 1 closest to the nose, and 12, which is the last cranial nerve, is going to be the one that's closest to the spinal cord. Okay, so you can see here, if you look, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7, which is right. I have a little trouble seeing it. 6. That's 8. There's 7. Okay. There's 8, 9, which would be IX. Here we go. There's 9. There's 10, the vagus. 11, and then 12. Okay. Now, what do each of these nerves do? Well, you can see by the graphic here essentially what they're designed to do. The first cranial nerve is called the olfactory nerve, and what it does is it provides your sense of smell. It is, strictly speaking, a sensory nerve. Okay, it only brings afferent information into the central nervous system. The olfactory bulbs are here and here. They lie just on top of the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, and they have little processes that extend down into the nasal cavity, and they provide your sense of smell. The second cranial nerve is the optic nerve, and you can see it here. And what it does is it provides your sense of vision. It runs into the back of the eyeball where it becomes the retina, and the retina is able to take light and color information and turn that into electrical information that gets sent through the optic nerve back to the occipital lobe of the brain, where we interpret this as sight. The oculomotor nerve is going to innervate muscles that move the eyeball. Okay, it's one of 3 nerves that innervate muscles that move the eyeball. The fourth cranial nerve is the trochlear. It also innervates muscles that move the eyeball, basically allows you to roll your eyes. The fifth cranial nerve is the trigeminal, and this is a mixed nerve to the face. It has 3 branches. 2 of the branches go through the sphenoid bone. Remember when we learned the openings of the sphenoid bone, the foramen rotundum, the foramen ovale, and the foramen spinosum. The rotundum and the ovale contain two of the branches of the trigeminal nerve. So this is mixed to the face. Over here, you've got the abducens nerve, okay? The sixth cranial nerve also moves the eyeball. It abducts the eye, so it lets the right eye look to the right, and it lets the left eye look to the left. Over here, the eighth cranial nerve is the vestibulocochlear nerve, and it provides our sense of hearing and balance. So it brings information into the temporal lobe for hearing, and for balance, it takes it into the core of the brain. Okay, the ninth cranial nerve down here is the glossopharyngeal. It talks to the tongue and the pharynx, so it helps with speech and with swallowing. The 10th cranial nerve is the vagus nerve, and it's an unusual nerve because it completely leaves the head and the neck, and it talks to our internal organs. And what it does is it causes them to act parasympathetically, meaning they cause physiological changes that promote rest and digest properties. The hypoglossal nerve is the 11th cranial nerve. I'm sorry, the 11th cranial nerve is the spinal accessory, which is down here. And it talks to the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius, so it moves muscles in the head and neck. And then finally, the 12th cranial nerve, the hypoglossal, talks to the tongue and also to the salivary glands, and it's involved in speech and in digestion. And so you can see a list here of the functions of the different cranial nerves. I won't go through them all, but you can see them here. Okay. So remember this list. This is an important list. Star this and know this material because I will definitely ask questions about it. Okay. And I want you to know the Roman numerals and also the names of the nerves. And so there's a mnemonic device that's been used for years and years by medical students that allows us to remember the cranial nerve names, and it goes on old Olympus, towering tops, a Finn and German viewed some hops. And so the way this goes, on stands for olfactory, old for optic, Olympus oculomotor, towering trochlear, tops trigeminal, A abducens, Finn facial, A again, and for and to German is for the old name of the vestibulocochlear nerve, which was the auditory nerve, okay? German for glossopharyngeal, viewed for vagus, some for spinal accessory, and then hops for hypoglossal. There's other mnemonics out there that are slightly different. If you like them, you can use them. That's just one of my particular favorites. And then there's another mnemonic that allows us to tell whether or not a cranial nerve is sensory or motor or both. So the mnemonic goes, some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter more. So in order from 1 through 12, it goes sensory, sensory, motor, motor, both, motor, both, sensory, both, motor, motor. Okay. When we say both, we mean mixed. Okay. The next part of the nervous system we want to talk about is the peripheral nervous system. And that's everything outside the brain and the spinal cord. And it's broken up, as you can see, into the somatic motor division and the autonomic division. The somatic motor division is our conscious control over our skeletal muscle, and the autonomic division is the part of the peripheral nervous system that controls our internal function and helps maintain homeostasis. And so when you think autonomic, think automatic. And essentially, it maintains our internal balance, and it's split into two divisions, the parasympathetic branch, which we call the rest and digest division. It's involved with homeostasis. And the sympathetic branch, which is called our fight or flight division or our panic division. So let's talk about the somatic sensory system first. It provides sensory input for your nervous system. It allows you to feel the world around you, and it includes the sense of touch, vibration, pain, temperature, and body position. Special senses are carried on cranial nerves, but information from somatic sensation comes into both the brain and the spinal cord. To attach meaning to the sensation, it must get to the brain so that the sensory association area can assign a category to it. The somatic sensory information comes into the spinal cord through the dorsal root, and it synapses with motor neurons in the ventral horn. And what you're looking at here are some of the spinal cord pathways for sensory information. So these are simply pathways that run from the spinal cord up to the brainstem in the brain. They bring information in, and the brain then interprets it. And the spinal thalamic tract runs from the skin to the somatic sensory cortex. The lateral tract provides information about pain and temperature from the skin to the somatic sensory cortex. The anterior spinal thalamic tract brings information about itch, pressure, and tickle from the skin to the somatosensory cortex. The dorsal column pathway brings information about fine touch and limb position from the skin and the joints to the somatic sensory cortex and the cerebellum. And the spinocerebellar tract runs information from the spinal cord to the cerebellum. The information is postural. It comes from joints and tendons, and it stops off in the cerebellum. The same axon that carries information to motor neurons further carries sensory information to your brain through tracts in white matter of the spinal cord so that you can feel somatosensory information, such as pain. Sensory information coming into the brain from the dorsal column and the spinothalamic tracts provides sensory information from the skin and the joints to a portion of the cerebrum called the primary somatosensory cortex, which is in the postcentral gyrus of the parietal lobe. The axons transport information to specific parts of the somatosensory cortex that correspond to different parts of the body. Neurons in the cortex are neurons that allow you to have conscious sensation. So essentially what's happening here is that information is coming in from sensory receptors that are in your skin and your joints and in your muscles. They run in through the dorsal root. They then climb up the spinal cord to the brainstem, then to the thalamus, and then the thalamus lets that information get up to the cerebral cortex, specifically the somatosensory cortex, where the brain then is able to know that that information is coming from a particular part of the body. That information then gets passed to the sensory association area where a category is assigned to it, and then that information gets integrated and sent to the frontal lobe where we decide what we want to do about it. Another area of the cerebral cortex that allows understanding and interpretation of somatic sensory information is behind the somatosensory cortex, and this is the somatic sensory association area. And what happens here is that we collect information from the spinal cord and the brainstem, pass it to areas in the thalamus, the cerebellum, and the cerebral cortex where it can be processed. And this is essentially where, once we've associated the stimulus with a category, we're able to distribute it to different parts of the brain where we decide what we want to do about it. Your understanding of complex sensory input happens only after the information is passed to the sensory cortex and the somatic sensory association area where it gets a category assigned to it. Now, the motor system is essentially our commands to our body. And here we're talking about the somatosensory or the somatic motor system. This is how we consciously control our muscles. It's a hierarchy, and it works in parallel with the somatosensory system with two differences. The information moves in opposite direction from the brain to the spinal cord, And second difference is that the motor system has two divisions, the somatic motor and the autonomic nervous system. And so here we're looking at the somatic motor. Okay, this is our control over our skeletal muscles. So we're walking down this branch of the little graphic here. The somatic motor system controls voluntary movement under orders that come from the cerebral cortex. In the frontal lobe, we have the premotor and the prefrontal area, and they plan movement. The plan from these areas is sent to the primary motor cortex in the prefrontal gyrus, and those orders are then sent to the spinal cord directly and also to the thalamus, the basal nuclei, and the cerebellum. The plan for the movement leaves the motor cortex and connects with neurons in the thalamus, located in the diencephalon. The thalamus, the basal nuclei, and the cerebellum are connected to each other, and what they do is that they fine-tune the movement. Posture and limb position get judged, and other movements are turned off, and movement and sensation get integrated with each other. So what's happening is that we're coordinating things, and we're also syncing up what we're trying to do with what we're actually doing. Without this coordination, our movements would be jerky and inaccurate, and probably most of the time wouldn't even happen. The cerebellum has a motor and a sensory input and outputs from the cerebral cortex, the thalamus, the basal nuclei, and the spinal cord. The cerebellum gets information about planned movement and actual movement and compares them to each other, and if the plan and the actual movement don't match up, the cerebellum adjusts the actual movement to fit the plan. The cerebellum works kind of in a mysterious fashion, but without it, we wouldn't be able to perform coordinated movement. After the movement information is processed by the thalamus and the basal nuclei, it moves to the spinal cord and the brainstem through corticospinal and corticobulbar tracts. Again, these tracts are named for where they start and where they stop. So the corticospinal tract starts in the cerebral cortex and ends in the spinal cord, and the corticobulbar tracts start in the cerebral cortex and they end in the brainstem. The corticospinal and bulbar tracts from the motor cortex are direct pathways. They carry orders to neurons in the brainstem and the ventral horn of the spinal cord. Pathways coming from subcortical structures, areas beneath the gray matter, are considered indirect pathways, and they help coordinate the movement. The function of the spinal cord pathways is to send orders from the brain to the motor neurons in the spinal cord and in the brainstem. Motor neurons in the spinal cord connect to skeletal muscles through cranial nerves in the brainstem or spinal nerves in the spinal cord, and they send orders to skeletal muscle to carry out planned movement or coordinate movements you're trying to carry out. The second function of the corticospinal and corticobulbar tracts is to fine-tune our reflexes and inhibit reflexes, making them softer than they would be if they had no influence coming from the brain. Now, sometimes we can affect the function of the somatic motor division. Parkinson's disease is an example of this, and in Parkinson's disease, what happens is that neurons in the midbrain that make a neurotransmitter called dopamine begin to die for reasons that we don't quite understand. And what we start to see are tremors, slow movement, impaired balance, and emotional and cognitive problems. What happens is these basal nuclei die, this affects the function of the cerebral cortex. We don't know why these neurons die, but we think that there might be some problems with mitochondrial function, viruses, and there might be a genetic component to this as well. The diagnosis is based on a history and a physical. Specific physical exam findings in Parkinson's are a shuffling gait and a rigid type of movement where muscles seem to catch and release when we move them. We also see tremor. Imaging isn't helpful because most early stage cases of Parkinson's have normal scans. ALS is a progressive fatal degeneration of the motor system. and it occurs when motor neurons in the cerebral cortex, brainstem, and the spinal cord begin to die. It used to be called Lou Gehrig's disease. On average, patients die within 5 years of diagnosis because the diaphragm and the heart quit working. It usually begins between 40 and 60. Symptoms include muscle weakness and twitching, cramping, and it progresses to paralysis and difficulty speaking and swallowing. Eventually, the diaphragm is paralyzed and it forces the patient to be put on a ventilator. Eye movements, bladder, and bowel control are usually retained. Again, we don't know the cause, but we think the damage may come from free radicals or problems within the cells, such as in the mitochondria. In most cases, there seems to be an excess activity of neuroglia and too much production of glutamate, which can increase neuron death. Now, the autonomic nervous system is that part of the nervous system that works without our conscious control. It exercises control over characteristics like blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate, digestion, and sweating. Neurons for the autonomic system are located in the spinal cord and the brainstem, and they release the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, but after that we have a lot of differences between the two systems. The autonomic motor neurons are located in the lateral horn rather than the ventral horns, and unlike the somatic motor neurons, autonomic neurons don't project directly to muscles. They make a synapse in an area of cell bodies outside the central nervous system called a ganglion, and this is what we call the presynaptic junction. A second motor neuron, called a postganglionic neuron, then goes all the way to the target. Now, the target could be smooth muscle. The target could be glandular tissue. The target could be another type of tissue, some other type of organ. There are no autonomic neurons in the cervical spinal cord. The autonomic nervous system, remember, has two subdivisions, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And what you're looking at here is sort of a diagram showing you how the two divisions are set up. Now, in the parasympathetic division, what we have are very long preganglionic neurons that mostly come from the head and the neck or down near the sacral region, and they go almost all the way to their target before they stop and then synapse with a second neuron that then carries the electrical information to the target. The neurotransmitter that's used by the preganglionic neuron is acetylcholine in the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. And in the postganglionic neuron, it's generally acetylcholine as well. In the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, we have a very short preganglionic neuron that secretes acetylcholine, a special structure on either side of the spinal cord called the paravertebral ganglia. And then a second neuron, called a postganglionic neuron, carries that information all the way to the target, and the neurotransmitter in the postganglionic neuron is epinephrine, which is sometimes called adrenaline. And these targets for the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions are usually the same organ or tissue, but not the same nerves. And they often have effects that are opposite each other. And what happens generally is that one or the other system, either the parasympathetic or the sympathetic division, is going to dominate depending on whether you're in a panic situation or whether you're in a relaxed situation where the body's trying to store up nutrients and get you ready for the next time you have a challenge. So these two divisions, they kind of seesaw, but it's not like when one is on, the other is off. And the control for most of this comes from the brainstem and the hypothalamus. We don't really have much awareness in the cerebral cortex of what's going on with our autonomic nervous system, but thank goodness we don't have to consciously control it, because if we did, we would have to think about all of our internal organs and when and where they function, and that would be so tedious that we wouldn't be able to manipulate our environment and survive. So it's a good thing that we have this option. So if we look at the sympathetic branch, it controls our fight or flight response, and it responds to emergencies. Some of the effects include an increase in the heart rate and blood pressure and respiratory rate. We sweat, we have dry mouth, and we have an increase in blood glucose and a reduction in urine output. And the idea here is to get the body ready for an emergency situation, okay, so that you can essentially get out of danger, okay? So this is why we call it our emergency division. The postganglionic neurons are located in the thoracic and the first two lumbar segments of the spinal cord. That's why it's sometimes called the thoracocolumbar division, whereas the parasympathetic is called the craniosacral. The preganglionic neurons secrete acetylcholine and synapse with postganglionic neurons in the sympathetic ganglia. These are a pair of chain-like structures that run parallel to the spinal cord, where neurons in the ganglia release norepinephrine. And so what happens here is that second neuron is going to carry the information all the way to the target. The sympathetic system stimulates adrenal glands to secrete hormones, the most important one being epinephrine, and this causes the adrenaline rush, and this is one of the reasons why when you panic, you don't calm down right away. It usually takes some time for the adrenaline to get out of your blood before your heart rate goes back down, your blood pressure goes back down, and you feel like you can relax again. Now, the parasympathetic division is different. It's often nicknamed the rest and digest division because its effects are often opposite what the sympathetic division does. It's responsible for everyday activity like reversing sympathetic effects. Its effects include a decreased heart rate, decreased respiratory rate and blood pressure, and increased digestive activity, including salivation and stomach activity. Neurons of the parasympathetic system are in the brainstem and the sacral spinal cord, and the neurotransmitter acetylcholine is released by the postganglionic neurons. And the targets, again, are internal organs, smooth muscle, and glandular tissue. And so these two divisions basically alternate their effects. One will predominate while the other becomes less active, and this maintains our body's homeostasis. And if we had to consciously control these functions, we would be totally unable to work with our environment. Okay, that brings to an end this summary chapter that essentially covers the entire nervous system all the way up through chapter 14. Be sure and review this material, work from the packet, because that's where the information for the quiz and the test is going to come from. And I'll see everyone in class.